We should explain what's in the Estrada Doctrine.
Oh, yes, please. Do you want me to go over the main 3 points?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's non-intervention, sovereignty, so the ability to, as they see it, to determine their own governments.
Self-determination, yeah, exactly.
And then the last one, diplomatic neutrality, specifically about who recognizing other states.
That's
or
right.
saying that they don't have an opinion and being able to say who governs the other states.
The Estrada Doctrine is a fundamental principle of Mexican statecraft, and the Mexican state does not actually practice any of those 3 things.
But they use it, and thus they say that that's why they can't intervene when anything else comes up, like human rights abuses.
This is something that you see over and over in Latin America, not just in Mexico, but sort of this you see it from Gustavo Petro in Colombia, and you definitely saw it from the Morenistas, because the Morenistas have this sort of feverish, poetic understanding of themselves and their place in history, but this very tendentious and heavy-handed moralizing about the way the world should be, which sits very poorly with a country in which tens of thousands have been killed through narco violence and continue to do so. So all the time you see it. The loftiness of the ambition is used and wielded as a reproach against other nations that have a more realistic and I would say, Athenian view of what statecraft is like. And this is used to accrue moral standing. And the suckers among us, particularly in our Department of State, will sometimes fall for it, but we don't have to.
And it's interesting how they continue to double down on that kind of stuff as well.
All the time.
So going
it's a way of life.
Even 2021 to 2022, going back to the OAS, or what is the...
Organization of American States.
Right, Summit of the Americas. That's what I was looking for.
Sorry. Yeah.
So the next time that they're hosting a Summit of the Americas, AMLO just flat out rejects the invitation.
Won't go.
Doesn't go.
That's the one in Los Angeles, right?
I thought it was... Oh, yeah, you're right. Los Angeles.
Yeah. He just flat out doesn't go. This, by the way, so this is 2022, yes, and so it's in 2022, and again, like we'll put all this into context. He rejects the American invitation to come to a U.S.-hosted Summit of the Americas in 2022, at the same time that he is, in his narco-state, is sponsoring an unprecedented movement of millions of trafficked people north into the United States. And I mean, just imagine that happening now. It's illustrative of just the fundamental weakness of the Biden administration. There's no other way to put it, that they allowed that. They allowed the insult, and that they allowed the insult in the context of the ongoing harm that the Mexican regime was doing to the U.S.
I also have a quote that was in the New York Times from what Obrador had said. So he said, "There can be no America summit if all the countries in the American continent do not participate. Or there can be, but we believe that means continuing with the politics of old of interventionism and a lack of respect for the nations and their people."
Well,
and again, he's using interventionism as his excuse for, we don't believe in that kind of interventionism.
Intervencionismo. And yet, this is a regime, and this still happens, this is a regime that weighs in against interventionism. And yet, what would one call the narco-state trafficking of millions, plus the fentanyl, plus the drugs, plus the illegal goods into the United States as anything
Josh, of course, they can't intervene in that.
Well, that's interventionism. Or talk about, we did a show on this not too long ago, the Mexican Consulate's active role in thwarting the Trump administration's agenda for deportations. That's interventionism. That's intervention in the United States in our internal affairs. The setting up of Morena party cells to press for U.S. policy change and to protest U.S. policy in the United States, that's interventionism. And then I would mention something that we have mentioned on the show before, that the Mexican military itself in a trafficking role is frequently encountered on U.S. soil. We've got over 100 examples from the past 10 years that we've gotten just from FOIA. I guarantee you that's the tip of the iceberg. That Mexican military incursion into the United States is also intervention. And so it stacks up over and over and over. What's the most interventionist power in the Western Hemisphere? We haven't even talked about Venezuela yet. We haven't even talked about Cuba yet. I know you're going to get to all that. But just the record with us, Mexico is the interventionist power. They don't follow the Estrada Doctrine, and they should be denied the opportunity. That regime should be denied the opportunity to cloak itself in the mantle of righteousness that it assumes unwarrantedly as a non-interventionist power. Totally false. They intervene all the time.
Right,
and we should do the same. We should.
Well, but there's also the fact that we're not pretending not to with holding up a doctrine and then using that doctrine to intervene by saying it's non-interventionalism. That's specifically what I wrote, is I called it the paradox of Estrada.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to put it. I will take your Estrada Doctrine and I will raise you a Monroe Doctrine.
Well, can you propose that to them, Josh, please? So moving forward, though, let's skip ahead a little bit. The criticisms that are open against the sanctions on Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, that's in 2023, and he was criticizing those economic sanctions. And I think that's important for us to recognize, because that, even though that happened in 2023 under his administration, that kind of criticism continues with Sheinbaum today.
Absolutely, it does. Look, Claudia Sheinbaum, who has done her best to cloak herself in the appearance of cooperation with the United States, nevertheless sends a ton of material support to the Venezuelan dictatorship and to the Cuban dictatorship. It is worth noting that in the Cuban case, there's a reciprocal arrangement where the Cubans will send doctors, which I'll put in quote, they're really intelligence agents, into Mexico. And so there's ample reason to believe that there's a ton of Cuban intelligence activity there, and there's probably support that's rendered, this is just a guess on my part,
right,
to the Morena regime from the Cubans. And that act of propping up these legitimately hideous dictatorships, by the way, take political prisoners, they murder people. You can't say enough bad things about communists in general. That goes double for Latin American communists. This is on the moral ledger of the Mexican regime. This is on Claudia Sheinbaum's moral ledger. This is not a holdover of AMLO, in which I think there's a sense that, well, it's Andrés Manuel, we'll see what's new. She's been in power a year now, actually over a year as we're recording this, and she continues to send the oil, to send the support, to send the material support to both Venezuela and Cuba. And it is just a pity and a shame that she does it, but it is because it is who she is, and it's because it's what her regime is. It is totally in keeping with and consonant with the ideological orientation of Morena.
And I have some of her comments that she made at the most recent, is it CELAC, right? Is that how they...
CELAC, yeah.
CELAC. So, and this again is, as they're saying, oh, the United States shouldn't be intervening, she then advocates for direct intervention. So she, in her speech, said, we will continue to denounce all forms of aggression, unilateral coercion measures against the dreams of peace and well-being for our peoples and governments, especially in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. We recognize the legitimate demand of the fraternal Caribbean peoples for reparations of the crimes of colonialism and slavery, and we reject any extortion against them for their efforts to achieve better living conditions and health for their peoples.
Look, it's funny you mentioned the aspirations for peace that she talks about rhetorically with the Venezuelan dictatorship, the Cuban dictatorship, the Nicaraguan dictatorship. There's a line that I remember from Richard Nixon's book, No More Vietnams, which is actually an excellent book. And so I read it. Anyway, I read it in high school. Great book, really very clarifying. But he has a line in there in which he talks about the support for these types of regimes. They can bring peace. He contends with that. But, says Nixon, it's the peace of the grave. And that's not a peace worth having. Yeah.
That's very well stated.
That's what Claudia is endorsing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've talked about how it interacts with the United States, but let's talk about Cuba, which you kept foreshadowing earlier. So this year, Mexico supplied a record amount of oil to Cuba between May 29th and June 27th.
Yeah.
So I'd known that relationship was going in the direction from Mexico to Cuba. I didn't realize that Cuba in exchange was sending back their own personnel.
They are. The Cubans have a long record of this, by the way. So it actually goes back. Well, it goes back arguably to the 1970s, depending on how you want to date it. But essentially, the Cuban state, the Cuban communist regime, has a generations-long experience sending cadres of essentially what I'll call euphemistically governance specialists, people who know how to run a secret police, people who know how to conduct internal suppression activities, to a variety of regimes. So they've been in Africa. They were very active in Angola, along with the Cuban Armed Force there during the UNITA War. They've been active in Venezuela. They helped consolidate Chavista rule there. And they're in Mexico too, and now they're much more under the radar in Mexico for obvious reasons because the United States is right next door. But I would hope that a good U.S. policy would demand their expulsion. We probably ought to do that. Yeah.
Well, let me play devil's advocate here just for a second, just for some fun. So one of the things that the Estrada document and what Sheinbaum and AMLO have tried to say is, well, the United States shouldn't interfere with other countries' interactions. So do you think in this case, would you still call this interventionism if they're just exchanging goods between one another?
Absolutely, because what they're doing is they're specifically propping up a regime that otherwise enjoys no legitimacy and would likely fall without that propping up. And they're doing it because they're telling themselves they're getting around the U.S. embargo. They're doing it because they actually like the dictatorship in Havana. They like the dictatorship in Caracas. And so it's a positive endorsement of them. It's absolutely interventionism. Now, look, I'm not here critiquing interventionism as such. This is part of the life of nations. Ever since the Melian dialogue, you see nations pursuing their interests. It is just and right for nations to do so. What I object to is the hypocrisy on the Mexican side and doing it. We pursue our interests. They do the same. There's nothing special about them. The only thing that is abhorrent is not that they pursue their interests, but that their interests align with dictatorship and evil so very often.
And do you also see it as, I guess, a move against the United States as well in doing so?
100%, 100%. Look, the Mexican regime, as is so often the case, plays a double game. In their relations with the United States, they adopt almost this supine posture of cooperation sin subordinación, right? And so we're the best partners you've got. And you talk to anybody in Mexican officialdom, they'll tell you that, like, oh, our partnership is so great. But then, in public, by the way, because they count on the incompetence of our diplomatic apparatus, which is actually, unfortunately, a pretty good bet in a lot of cases. But they'll turn around and they'll send the oil to Cuba. They'll render the support to the other dictatorships. They'll liaise with the anti-American powers, including Russia and China, by the way. But let's not forget, just 2 years ago, under AMLO, that Russian and Chinese troops were literally marching through the Zocalo on Mexican Independence Day. It's not that long ago. And so, they fundamentally, they know they have to deal with us, but from an ideological perspective, they dislike us. Morena is an ideologically anti-American movement. It always has been. The Mexican left has always been orientated in that direction. That doesn't mean Mexicans in general hate the United States. I don't think that's actually true. But the ruling elite now that has controlled the country for the past, 7 years at this point, 100% are oriented against us. And if they had the power to wipe us from the world stage, of course they would. There's no question about that.
Well, you mentioned that they are taking advantage of U.S. incompetence in certain ways.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're, becoming more competent over time in dealing with them?
I will say that my answer will be the same.
Or maybe are there improvements that we can make? Like, what would those improvements look like?
That's a better question. Thank you. On the first one, I would give the same answer that Zhou Enlai gave when asked about the French Revolution, which is that it's too soon to tell. So ask me in 200 years. Yes, there are improvements we can make. We have to demand and enforce the demand with real consequences that the Mexicans align themselves with us. They can protest their sovereignty all they wish. The reality is that they exist in an ecosystem, and we have, frankly, every right to insist there not be Cubans in Mexico, that there not be Chinese in Mexico, that there not be narcos in Mexico in particular. And look, this redounds to the benefit of the Mexican people themselves, by the way. It's in their interest as well to do that. But, our toleration for regime misbehavior, even now, even in the past year, has been way too liberal, in my view. Now is the time, and we have an opportunity, especially with the Trump administration, which I think has a generally realistic view of how power in the world works, to bring accountability. And if you don't take this moment, it's not coming again, because the nightmare scenario is that they are able to, post-Trump, which will come someday, maybe in 10,000 years, who knows? But, when that day comes, the nightmare scenario is that they've consolidated the rule, they've stamped out civil society in Mexico, it's a true autocracy, and then our levers versus that regime are effectively gone, and that is a whole different world that we don't want to see come to fruition.